Hello, friends, and welcome back to Season 3 of the CUInsight Experience. This episode is brought to you by an old friend of the show, PSCU. We're glad to have them back on board as a sponsor. As the nation's premier payments CUSO, the folks at PSCU proudly support the success of more than 1,500 credit unions. My name is Randy Smith. I'm one of the co-founders of CUInsight.com, and I'm lucky enough to have the gig on the show to get to have conversations with the best and the brightest of the credit union community. I get to pick their brains and see if we can't find a few nuggets that we can all learn from. My guest on today's show is probably a familiar face to many around credit union land, Mr. Antonio Neves. Antonio is an internationally recognized leadership speaker, author, podcaster, and success coach. Antonio was also our first keynote in the CUInsight Minicon series that we launched last November. Before I bring Antonio on, I'd like to share a little background on why he's my guest today, beyond the obvious from his bio that I just read. I knew I wanted to take a little breather, a time off over the holidays from the podcast. And I'll tell you, I found myself not taking as much joy in recording these as I really had over the first couple of years, and I couldn't put my finger on why. I love the conversations with my guests. I love the idea of sharing stories and the lessons learned of so many of the remarkable people we have around the credit union movement. So I was struggling with what had changed. Where did my, love for doing this podcast go? It wasn't gone, but it just didn't feel the same. Was something different? Was I different? Did I need to just tear the whole thing down and start from scratch? I'll tell you, I spent weeks asking myself these questions. Jill heard it a ton, at home, and was supportive as only one human can be. Lauren was probably waiting for me to figure my bleep out since she had a year to plan as our CEO. In the end, I was still struggling with what was missing, and then it started to come to me. It wasn't what was missing, but it was what had been added to it. COVID. All the conversations were about the things that were top of all the conversations we were having last year, whether it was at work or at home. COVID. It had become emotionally draining. The reason I share this is because I'm sure many of you have, felt similar. I've had quite a few conversations with people. So I started working on getting back to basics, creating an experience that's timeless, not necessarily timely, to share the stories of how leaders in our movement got to where they are, what lessons they've learned in their career, what they've learned in life and picked up along the way, and to share those with all of you. A conversation about credit unions, leadership lessons learned, and life. The show wasn't broken. I wasn't broken. The guests weren't broken. I'd just gotten away from what made the CUInsight Experience such a special experience. And that's where Antonio came in. Over and over, I kept thinking of things he said during his presentation during REFUEL. As I was planning the first episode of season 3, I realized I was going to reference that presentation so often, it just made sense to reach out to him and see if he would join the conversation. I was on a short time crunch, so I wasn't sure if it would happen. I emailed him on Thursday. We recorded the episode on Friday after his day was done. He was gracious enough to fit us in and push back the start to his weekend to have this conversation with me. I am so excited for season 3 of the CUInsight Experience. It's the time for us to all give ourselves that space to take a half hour, an hour, to learn from some of the best around. Not how to solve every issue today you might be dealing with, but how to be a better leader and maybe even a better human from the experience and the stories that they all share with us. So with all that said, I give you my conversation with Antonio Neves. This is a good one, friends. I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. Happy New Year. Here's to 2021, full of amazing experience for all of us. Enjoy. Antonio, welcome to the show.
It's an honor to be here and join you. Thank you for having me.
I do greatly appreciate, as I mentioned in the intro, you taking the time today and on short notice and postponing your weekend and everything, basically the start of it, let's just say. So thank you again, my friend. I wanted to start, as I did mention in the intro, the idea for this episode was kind of quite a process for me to get to. And after, the year that was, I thought I wanted to do something different with the podcast, but in the end, and you and I were just talking about this before we hit record, it was kind of that idea of like getting back to the basics and where the idea to start this thing. And it was that idea of like kind of just pushing pause on, it seems like to me, we've all been in that space where we're just putting out immediate fires, or we feel like we needed to. And in the beginning of the COVID experience, that was the case, right? But now that we're further down the road, I'm not sure if that's true. So while I was thinking about this, I kept thinking back to your presentation at REFUEL in November and all these tips that you shared. So instead of just talking about you the whole time, I was like, maybe Antonio will take the time and you can be on the show. So they could hear it from you. So anyways, I do appreciate that a ton. I'd like to start with the big question. I know, like everyone else out there, last year you had to pivot, like what the way you make your living, basically, things changed. As we look forward, the question that I've been struggling with, some of those pivots were good and are probably lasting, right? They can help us all. But then others, maybe were appropriate for the time, but as we move forward, are they? Is there something, I guess, that you have a hack or something that you've come across for the listeners that, are trying to look forward and maybe, like keep coming up with that idea of scarcity, right? Like moving out of that scarcity mindset.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that one way to look at it is, I think there's always opportunity within change. I think so many of us are afraid of change. Yeah, pandemic, really big change. But there are other types of changes that can actually lead to cool opportunities. I think about many organizations that were going through challenging times, and many of the innovations came during those challenging times when they had to get creative in ways they previously didn't have to, when the bank accounts were full and they had lots of people, et cetera. As you mentioned, I had to pivot a lot. I'm a guy that earns his income most times getting on a plane and showing up somewhere. And what happens all of a sudden when that comes to an end and those checks start coming in? So I had to pivot to the different offerings that I offer to my clients, whether it's virtual talks, different types of consulting, et cetera. I will say during times like these, a couple of things can come up. One, we find out what we really love. I found out what I really love and what I really took for granted as well. A lot of people say, Antonio, you're an entrepreneur. Yeah, you make money other ways beyond speaking on stages, but you want to find ways where you don't have to show up to get paid. But, for me, the counter to that is, but I love it. Like, it's not like it's like a bane to my existence that I have to show up somewhere and go to some small town to speak. I absolutely love it. So I think a lot of us, we found out what we love and what we desperately miss right now, connecting with others. On the flip side,
I have to ask you this. Like, I've found, and this is just a poll that has no significance really, but out of the group of what I call like my friends from around credit unions who traveled quite a bit before this, it seems almost easily divided. I fall in the camp that I can't wait to get back on the road. And others are like, I don't want to travel like that anymore. Where are you?
I'm in the middle. I'm in the middle. I love people. I love the process of traveling. I love getting a rental car in a town I've never been to and going to explore. I will say this time that I've had at home with my wife and 4-year-old toddler twins has been a gift as well, because the truth is, and this isn't just for people who get on planes and travel 500 to 7,500 miles a month. We get to escape and not sometimes be fully present, even when we just are in a job in our hometown. We are escaping. Like, think about this. If you have a standard 9 to 5, which is never 9 to 5, when it comes to your commute, when it comes to what time you get home in the evening, you might get a couple of hours with your family, significant other, if you have one. That's it. And what do we do during that time? We'll eat, maybe we'll watch something on Netflix or something, but we don't truly connect. We've had to truly connect during this time. And if anything, we've learned how much we've been able to hide from our family, hide from our spouses, sometimes even hide from our friends. So this gave me an opportunity to deeply, deeply connect. And for those people right now who are having a hard time, and I get it, I get wanting to be back on the road because I do as well. But I also had to ask myself, like, for those people that don't want to be home, they have to ask themselves why.
Yeah.
Because come on, let's think about the home. It's home, right? That's where we're supposed to be at peace, at ease. And there are a lot of people saying, I'm not at peace. I'm not at ease at home. So that's some deep questioning that they have to ask themselves about, like why they're better only when they jump on a plane or they're traveling as opposed to being home for extended periods. And I've had to ask myself that question.
Oh yeah, no, that's one that I've asked both Jill, my partner, and I. We enjoy the travel, like the disconnect of it and the time on planes and things like that, and we get stir crazy sitting around. So,
well, it's cool when you get to travel together as well. So that's awesome.
She also works in credit union, so there's overlap, and then the personal side. So it's it does work out well for us. I kind of wanted to stick with that idea of scarcity, and we only have so much time. Only so much bandwidth. If we constantly feel like we're putting out fires, it's tough to find that space to, something I know, like I'm at my best when I have space to think strategically and have those thoughts. Anything that we should be doing that to kind of create that space as leaders, because that's who's listening.
Yeah. Well, first, a couple of things come to mind is I think we really have to get clear on our priorities, like what it truly is most important. Nothing blows me away, man, when I go to organizations and I do consulting or talks. And before I go on stage, they share, here are our top 13 priorities for 2021. And I'm like, you're not going to get through 3 of those. How do you have 13? So I think less is more. We're trying to keep too many options open. So I like to think about life and even work and within a specific department or organization, like a computer operating system. And as you know, if we have too many apps running at the same time, what happens? We slow down.
Yeah.
Worst case scenario, it can lead to a crash. Like things not getting done. So I invite people to use this time just from an individual perspective to identify what quote unquote apps in their life and in their work need to stay open. What projects need to be quote unquote minimized or closed for the foreseeable future? A great question I like to, when people are come to me for coaching clients, they're like, hey, Antonio, my boss is coming to me and they're putting more and more on my plate and I don't know where to prioritize. I always say, hey, go back to your boss and say, hey, out of these 12 things that you gave me, what are the 3 most important? And they say, well, all of them are important. And like, no, all of these can't have equal importance. Which ones are the 3 most important? And when you make people choose like that, you put them on the spot, they will tell you that, because a lot of times those other things are those things that they're feeling angst and anxiety about, that they're trying to do a little bit of everything. So 1, identify what apps need to be open. And even if you're a leader, it can be scary. Sometimes you have to minimize or push pause on certain endeavors and projects that just aren't important for right now. And what's amazing when you do that from an organizational perspective, or you even do that from an individual perspective, like, okay, this quarter, these are the 3 things that are most important to me, whether it be personally or business wise. It gives you a new lens on life. And let me give you a practical example. Like if you wake up tomorrow and before you do anything, you open up your computer, you open up your phone, you've identified the 3 most important things for the day. You know what happens when you open up your email inbox? No matter what comes in, you're not getting distracted because you've already set the agenda for your day. Right? I have to remind people all the time that your inbox is not your to-do list.
Right.
We confuse those things. So I invite you to identify what's most important about that day. If nothing else gets done today, what is it? And then open your inbox. That will give you a new focus, because you'll see that one thing you're about to act on. That's what Jim or Karen wants done. That's their priority. It's not yours.
Something that kept coming to mind when you were talking about that was, I know something I got away from in the last, let's just call it last year, was saying no to things, and not like, why am I doing this? And that's something that I think if you're, if you just say yes to everything, then where's the focus, right?
But the bigger thing is this, like, let's be clear, especially if a quote unquote superior, which I don't like that word in the workplace because I think we're all a team and we work together. But if a boss tells you to do something, you're afraid. We're afraid to say no, right? I think, but if there's anything that hopefully we all learned during this year is being willing to take a stand for certain things. And more than anything, here's the thing, we can't take a stand for everything, right? It goes back to our priorities, but there's some things we have to take a stand for. But what that also means, and this is the challenging part right here, is something that it seems like we're unwilling to do. And we can run away from it even more now because we're not seeing people face to face and we're on computers, is I invite people to be willing to have more uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
You know what? Right now, there's probably a conversation that for someone listening to this, there's probably an uncomfortable conversation that you need to have with your partner. That's been something that's been bothering you or that's been bothering them. And guess what? It may not be resolved after you share it. It may be a really awkward 13 minutes, but let me tell you, you are going to sleep better after you say it out loud. It's the same thing with that conflict maybe you're having with a colleague, that disagreement you have with maybe some priorities for the department and the direction you're going. I'm not saying that you're always going to get the result that you want or things are going to change, but there's an amazing momentum that we create as a human being when we're willing to say our piece, when we say things from our perspective. And again, it may not go our way, but it helps us walk a little bit taller. And it changes our relationship slowly but surely with others as well, especially if we do this from a constructive perspective. I'm not saying go and breaking stuff and throwing things. I'm just saying, hey, yesterday in that meeting when you proposed X, Y, and Z, based on what's happening in our department right now, I don't think it's good timing for that. And let me tell you why. And maybe you can help me understand why you think this is important right now, right? You just have that conversation. But we're unwilling to have these tough conversations, and not having tough conversations adds up just like compound interest.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's going to be even worse later.
Compound interest on a credit union podcast. Well played. Something I was interested to ask you was that you do work, you've mentioned it, you work with leaders from coast to coast, many different industries. Just off the top of your head, is there someone that you think is doing this leadership thing well? And what is it that you admire about them, or is something that we could all learn from?
There's a human resources leader. I'm not going to say her name, but with the credit union in Southern California, that's doing something, that did something over the course of the pandemic. I guess it's still the pandemic that really stood out to me. What I've found, unfortunately, and I've saw this in my television career as well, with politicians and leaders, et cetera, typically during challenging times, people disappear. Leaders disappear. And the reason why they disappear when it comes to communication is because they're like, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing. We haven't got all the information yet. I don't want to mess up. So they disappear and you don't hear from the leader. But what I can tell you right now is that employees want to hear from you on a regular basis, even if you don't have the full story. Yeah. Even if you can't clearly tell them what direction you're going, they want to know that you are there. And so what this leader has done in Southern California, head of a big human resources credit union, head of a human resources, is she emails the whole organization every single day.
Every day, huh?
Every day, every weekday, emails them. Doesn't necessarily give them always answers, but shares some motivation, shares some encouragement, shares where we stand today, things that are on the horizon, etc. I think the days of hearing from senior leaders once a quarter in an email or once a quarter at the quarterly meeting, those days need to go away.
Yeah.
We need to hear from you on a regular basis. Maybe it's not the CEO doing that, but if you have a team that you're responsible for, don't hide from them. They want to hear from you more. And by the way, just a reminder, in my experience, people don't leave companies, they leave their managers.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on that. During Refuel, you had ideas that it just inspired a ton of comments in the chat about getting back that spark. I think, if people had, felt a bit lost, and we received so much feedback after that about, that just was people saying, I needed that. Like, I needed to hear it. So for all those folks who didn't attend, maybe they'll come to the next one. The title of your book, How Do We Stop Living on Autopilot and Start Leading with Purpose? I think everybody should go out and buy it. We'll link to it every place. But what is that spark? What do you recommend to everybody listening?
Well, first, I just ask you a simple question. I'll ask listeners a simple question. What have you stopped doing that has got you to where you are today?
Yep.
What are those things that you have stopped doing that got you where you are today? I don't care if we're talking about work, if we're talking about our marriage or relationships, if we're talking about finances, health, fitness, etc. What have you stopped doing that got you where you are today? I think what has happened, and this is extremely evident, specifically in the year 2020, is I'm going to go to sports. I'm going to talk about sports for a quick second just to give some color to this. Is I think so many people in life, they're like a American football team that comes out and they play an amazing first half and they go to halftime winning the game 35-0. They're winning the game 35-0 at halftime. And then they come out of that locker room after halftime and something happens. They show up a little bit differently. Before you know it, it's the fourth quarter, and that 35-0 lead is now 35-32. There's 2 minutes to go, and they're only up by 3 points.
You're hurting me as a lifelong Detroit Lions fan.
Listen, I'm from the Great Lakes state of Michigan, and it breaks my heart too, man. I'm a Detroit Lions fan as well, and I don't know why they can never freaking win that Thanksgiving game. Anyhow, that's another.
It's always the fourth quarter, right?
It's always the fourth quarter.
Can't close.
But what we're talking about is that team that went up 35-0 in the first half. They were playing to win the game in the first half. In the second half, they came out playing not to lose.
Yep.
Those are two different mentalities. So right now, I do a lot of coaching. I do group coaching programs for executives and leaders. I do one-on-one coaching. And it always blows me away that these amazing, talented men and women who have titles like director or founder or vice president or AVP or senior vice president, once they get these titles and they get in the positions, they stop doing the things that got them there. They stop being innovative. They stop taking risks. They stop taking action on their ideas. To sum it up the way I do in the book, they stop being bold and courageous, because all of a sudden they feel like, oh no, I made it here. So now I have something to lose if I do these things. And I feel like, no, you have something to gain. For many people, atrophy is settling in. They feel it in their body. There's a metaphorical tap on their shoulder saying, you're doing a good job, but there's more for you to give. You're not showing up. You're not holding up the end of your bargain. And just briefly in the talk, I asked people to think about when they first began the job they're currently in.
Right.
And remember how excited they were when they interviewed for the position, how excited they were when they founded this company, how excited they were when they found out they got hired, how they showed up that first week, that first month, and just to quiz themselves and say how much of that man or woman still exists. Or are you still contributing, or are you settling? And sadly, far too many people have settled.
Gosh, that's, that hit me then also. So
it's all of us. It's all of us. Can I add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have to say this, man, because this is important for people listening. When I ask these questions, what I don't want people to do is to beat themselves up with the answer. All we're talking about is data. That's data that we can now act on. So if you're like, okay, you know what? The past 30 days, I didn't show up the way I wanted to, or 2020 was my best. That's okay. All this is data. And the cool news is that today, I'm not talking about for the next 3 months or the next year. I'm talking about today we get to make a new decision.
Absolutely. One of the things that came up over and over the first couple of years of the podcast from leaders was that, and it was the transition from, say, being maybe a more junior person in the organization to becoming that senior member and having to delegate and, lead a team, which was often different because many times people get there because they were that A-type personality who puts their head down and, charges. And all of a sudden you can't do it all by yourself, right? So one of the things that you just said is, doing what you like, but it seems like there sometimes is that struggle, right? Between keep doing what you've always been doing, but now wait, nope, your job's changed. You got to lead people, to make sure that they're doing what they want to be doing. Anything there? Because I know that was something that I struggled huge with after starting CUInsight. In the beginning, it was just David and I, right? So we just did everything. And then as you brought people in, letting go of that, this is again, a scratch my own itch question, but it's a interesting thing.
Yeah. It's so funny, right? I mean, I was a sales representative when I first began my career with a major food organization, and, sales representatives, they're out in the field, they're dealing with their clients. I was dealing with grocery stores. And what happens is, of course, you're great dealing with these people. Then all of a sudden you do good and you get promoted and you're no longer doing that anymore.
Doing the job, right? Yeah.
You're leading other people who are doing that. Yeah. So the only suggestion I have for those people that are making that adjustment is, first and foremost, don't go about things alone. I'm a firm believer that no one who has accomplished anything of significance did it alone, and neither should we. So I invite people to make sure they're part of a group coaching program, or they have some peers around them that are experiencing the same thing that they can get feedback from, like their own personal board of advisors as well, because you're not the only one who has experienced this. But also, I think it's important, if you can, to negotiate in that promotion, in that new position, or if you happen to be the founder of the organization, to create some space to ensure that you are operating in your zone of genius, at least giving yourself some time to do that. We all have a certain space that we absolutely love. And now that you're progressing and things are happening, it doesn't mean you're going to get to operate in that space 100% of the time. But if you know one day a week or half a day a week, you get to exist in that place where, you come alive, where you get to deal one-on-one with individuals or do certain things. I think that would benefit you 100%. It'd benefit all of us. Then I talk about the zone of genius. Gay Hendricks writes about this in his book, The Big Leap. And we have 4 areas that we can operate in. Just briefly, we can operate in the zone of incompetence. That's self-explanatory. Yep. The zone of competence, that is the place where we can do things, but there are other people that can do it better than us. Then there's the zone of excellence. That's the tricky one. The zone of excellence is the one that we excel in, but we don't necessarily enjoy. That's the one where we say just because you're good at something doesn't mean you're supposed to be doing it. But then there is the zone of genius. That is the place, that space where it's a unique skill set onto us, where that's where the time disappears. And that's the thing that we're most excited to work on. So I invite people to try to spend as much time as possible in that zone of genius as possible. For some people, it may only be 20% of their time. For others, it may be 40, 60, you name it. But right now, as we're interviewing this, I'm sure you can identify the things you get most excited about that you no longer get to do.
Absolutely.
And maybe there are some ways that you can give yourself half a day a week, if not more, to do that.
No, I just have to stay at Lauren's way. She does it better than I did. So,
right. Well, Lauren, this could be operating in what was your zone of excellence, but you have a different zone of genius that she doesn't have, that other people don't have.
100%. That's why she's here, though.
And by the way, can I just say something cool? Yeah. You say that's why she's here because you did something that a lot of entrepreneurs and CEOs are unwilling to do, are to hire people, to empower people who are better than them in other roles to lead.
It was a tough decision to get to, but I should have probably done it a few years earlier. So
and you did it. And you did it. Some never do it.
That's true. Something that was sticking in my head quite a bit, again, there was so much from that you talked about, but is that idea of, and I know you talk about in your book, of finding purpose. And that's not a tough thing to do generally in credit unions overall, but they're very purposeful organizations. But what tools do, you have to make sure that we're living within that purpose? And is there a difference between that individually and professionally?
100%. Well, first, let's talk about dream jobs, right? At first, can we just stop just attaching all of our identity to our professions? I mean, in this day and age, I know it's almost impossible, but right. Here's a great question I like to ask people, and I'm going to actually put you on the spot. Yep. Is that okay if I put you on the spot with this question? If you had to introduce yourself to a group of strangers, but you couldn't reference your profession or your career, how would you introduce yourself? What would you tell them about them without referencing anything about your background or your career?
Explore. Basically. Gosh, this speaks to me like so much because a few years back, I spent a ton of time personally on this idea that because David and I built CUInsight, I felt like my identity was CUInsight and I didn't want to be CUInsight. There's more to me than just that. So, that idea of I'm somebody who likes new experiences and exploring new things. And that's what started CUInsight, was more than anything. But it also is something that I've always firmly believed too. Like when we created our community section, so many people that contributed wanted their company logo or the company name. And we're like, people, you don't introduce yourself as an individual. You're not your company. You work for your company, right? So I don't walk around saying, hi, I'm CUInsight. That's not who I am. So it's, you're speaking to me there. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you said you were an explorer, but what you did, you made yourself a human. Like, again, I invite people to ask themselves that question. How would you introduce yourself to a stranger if you couldn't reference your career? Because we are more than that. And what we're talking about with that right there is being willing in some shape or form. And we'll get to the point of purpose here in a second, of being willing to endorse ourselves. Like, we have to be willing to endorse ourselves, stand for something without saying with company X, company Y, etc. We're exceptional enough without those things. So being willing to endorse yourself. I like to think about dream jobs, right? We always have this whole notion of dream jobs and only finding our fulfillment from jobs. And I don't think that's the case. A good friend of mine, someone you should have on this podcast, you would love, Mitch Matthews. He has a cool definition of dream job. He says a dream job is a job that you absolutely love or a job that allows you to do what you love. Yeah. So when you reframe that job that you despise, that you hate, is that as that thing that allows you to work on your novel in the evenings or do that other hobby on the weekends, things begin to change because yes, this is my dream job because it allows me to pursue my other passions, those things I care about in the evenings or the weekends, or allows me to do these activities with my kids and my family and beyond. So we can reframe what a dream job is. As far as passion and purpose, you'll laugh at this. I have a little bit of a conflicted relationship with the word passion nowadays because I think people believe that once they pursue work they're passionate about, like me, I have my own company and I do X, Y, and Z. They think that once they pursue work that they're passionate about, that all of a sudden there's going to be rainbows every day. There's going to be unicorns walking by and you'll be eating like rainbow Skittles. But I think we have to recall that even with work that you're passionate about, many days still feel like you're working a shift.
Absolutely.
Like people think all of a sudden it's going to be sunny every day. Like, no, many days, even though no one's forcing me to do what I'm doing, I feel like I'm working a shift, but it's okay because it's a shift that I chose.
Absolutely.
So I have a bit of a conflicted relationship with the word passion, but I just invite people not to have their whole identity stuck in their career. Like nowadays, when people, I say I'm Gigi's husband and August and Harper's father.
Yeah.
Like that makes me, by the way, that makes me walk taller than saying I'm a speaker and an author. When I identify myself with my wife and my kids, I walk taller. Like, oh, I got to represent. I'm representing them.
A couple of twin 4-year-olds, you said, right? So
oh my God. They might break in here anytime. Yeah.
I'm sure that's happened. So to all of us, right? So there was a term that I saw from the book, and it was that idea of being an active player in your own life. Does that tie into what you're talking about right here? Is like you control this, or is that I guess a whole different thought?
No, I think we are. I think a lot of us, we've got to the point where we expect other people to care more about our life than we do. Our family, our friends, our partners, our bosses. I mean, we expect, at some point we have to realize no one can care more than we do. We have to be an active player. We have to be, in many ways, our own benefactors, if you will. I like to think about benefactors. And, back in the day, artists as diverse as Mozart and Picasso and Harper Lee, they had benefactors. Benefactors are organizations or rich patrons that paid and allowed them to do their work. Nowadays, benefactors look a little bit differently because there are things like Indiegogo and Kickstarter and GoFundMe. And, we've been led to this place where people believe that they only can pursue something or do something if they get the backing of a benefactor or an Indiegogo or a Kickstarter. I think we've gotten a little bit lazy. And what I'm inviting people to do is to be willing to be their own benefactor. One thing I wish I would have told people earlier on in my entrepreneurial journey, in the 8-9 years I've been doing this, is there a time as a speaker and a coach that I held full-time jobs, but I didn't tell anyone. I wish I would have told them, but I was like, oh, they think I'm living this full-time world. No, there were times I had a 9-to-5 flying to San Francisco every week as the head of personal branding platform About.me higher education division. Yeah. There was a time when I had a full-time job leading the narrative division of a big e-commerce agency. I was being my own benefactor while simultaneously pursuing this work as well. People nowadays, just give you another example. And by the way, this isn't me tooting my horn by no means. Those are some long, exhausting days I'm sure you can maybe relate to as you're nodding your head. But people are like, oh, it must be nice to have this big book deal with Penguin Random House in Rodale for this book to come out. And what they don't talk about is, go to Amazon. There are 3 other books on there by me that I self-published.
Yeah, exactly.
Before anyone ever was my benefactor or endorsed me, I had to endorse myself. Yeah. And without those things, this book deal never would have happened. So I invite us to be willing to endorse ourselves and find ways to be our own benefactor.
2 things there. First of all, we will link to your book. So everybody should, especially check out the new one. Just the new one, right? Yeah, don't look at the old stuff. But, I just had a shared experience. It's just what you were saying about having the full-time gig as you were starting this part of your career. CUInsight was a side hustle for the first 2 years. So it was a glorious day when you could kind of quit doing the other thing because what I felt like it was a passion project actually could sustain us. So it's kind of a cool thing at that point. But yeah, you put in a lot of time. I have a scratch.
Just briefly, I'm sorry.
No.
All I'm saying, back to the active player thing, I just think too many of us are standing on the sidelines.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
The game day is here. Take off the practice uniform, put on the game uniform, and get in there.
Something that Jill and I have talked about for the 3 years of our relationship is being intentional in everything, right? If we're going to do something, we're doing it intentionally. If we want to travel, we intentionally travel. We make the time for it. If, you talked about reconnecting, we are intentional to make sure that we're staying connected, right? So, yeah, be active. I have to ask this. I kick myself if I didn't. It's just a scratch my own itch question. A fellow podcaster, I recommend everybody check yours out. It's called The Best Thing. Awesome interviews. I was listening to a few the last couple of days, actually, walking around. So, as a fellow podcaster, what brought you, joy from doing your show? And is it, do you kind of get that energy from the conversations you have with others?
Going back to living on autopilot, even though a few years ago things were going good in my career and I was speaking on stages on a regular basis, staying busy and everything on the internet looked good and I was checking off the boxes, I realized something was missing from my life. And what was missing from my life is there's nothing that I love more. And this goes back to my TV background.
That was good. Yeah.
Nothing I love more, probably like you, is having fascinating conversations with fascinating people.
Absolutely.
And I found that over the past few years, all I was doing was talking to audiences as opposed to having conversations. And I decided I needed to be bold and courageous because I come from an old school day and age of television where before YouTube and Facebook and all that, where you only did something if there was a sponsor involved.
Yeah.
So I always told myself that, I'll start a podcast when I can say this podcast is brought to you by X or Y. But I needed to take my own advice and I decided to start my own podcast to be a little bit more bold, to be a little bit more courageous, to be willing to endorse myself the way I tell other people to. And let me tell you, in over 50 plus episodes of doing this podcast called The Best Thing, where we talk to people about the best thing to happen to them that would rarely appear on a resume or come up in conversation, it has brought me more joy than you ever would believe. And to be clear, I guess I can call it a loss leader because on podcasts, they always say, hey, this podcast is brought to you by Antonio Neves because there is no sponsor right now. I'm paying for it myself and I'm more than okay with that. I'm pretty certain really soon, I know for a fact, soon there will be some sponsors, but that's not why I do it. But I also find that even many of my speaking clients nowadays, when they like, hey, we listen to the podcast, it's adding value in that regard. So yeah.
When I started this, we do have a sponsor. We're very thankful for PSCU currently. But I was very intentional of not to have one the entire first year because I just wanted to kind of do my own show, right? Like without and build it out how just kind of get through those lumps and stuff. So yeah, no, I get that completely. It wouldn't be the CUInsight Experience podcast without some rapid fire questions. It's something we do every show. So I've mixed in a few ones. It's the start of season 3 here. So the questions are rapid, but your answers don't have to be. Do you remember that moment? You talked about having the full-time career and doing the speaking, but do you remember that moment where this is what you wanted to do for your career? And then also maybe that spot where you were like, wow, I can make a living doing this.
Yeah, they reached an interesting point a few years into speaking when the checks started looking a little bit different. And I say different, but the correlation to that was the work and the prep that I was doing actually led to that. I was showing up a lot differently on the stages than I did early on. And I was getting a lot of repeat business, et cetera. And there's a moment when I was like, you know what? This can be my full-time thing. I can leave this job behind. And it felt pretty amazing. It's scary as well because I don't come from a background where there are business owners or entrepreneurs in my family. So I was kind of trying to figure this out on my own. I always dreamed of being able to do something like this. I think it was a blessing that I had that first job as a sales representative and I didn't have to go to an office because I don't like offices, at least being there every single day and somebody expecting me to sit at a desk. That's just not how I can roll in life. But yeah, there were some moments when I looked at the bank account and I looked at the calendar and I was like, wow, for the guy who left TV in 2012 and only booked maybe 3 or 4 speaking engagements that first year to then one day looking at a calendar that had 40 over the course, strewn out over the course of the year. I was like, I was like, that's something. And of course, it didn't happen on its own. I have amazing advocates and allies in my life that have supported me and allowed for that.
That is awesome. I love it. Is there something that you said no to that you're sure glad you did?
Oh man, there are a few television programs that I could have went back into and hosted.
Okay.
I think when you pursue the work that you want to do, we can call it a passion if you want, but when you make an intentional decision to pursue the work and do what you want to do, what happens is shiny objects tend to show up.
Absolutely.
Sometimes even when you get in relationships, like you commit to someone, then all of a sudden someone like that you wanted to date 3 years ago, all of a sudden texts and say, "Hey, I moved back to town." And I think these people show up to see if we're serious about what we're talking about. So there were some distractions from a career perspective where I could have gone back into the television realm over the years. That I made some decisions that on paper, from a dollars and cents perspective at the time, said, dude, you need to go back to TV and get that check. But I knew I had to commit and continue to create my own momentum. If I committed, I believed, not to sound corny, but the universe would act accordingly and in my favor once it saw me doing that, even though it was scary at the time that I made that decision. So yeah, there's some TV and some other professional opportunities that I had that I turned down when I had kids, by the way. That was very, very scary.
What was Antonio like in high school? Was it Michigan? I'm
from this town called Jackson, Michigan.
I was born in Jackson, Michigan.
Get out of here, man.
I swear. My parents moved to Midland, Michigan when I was about 3, I think it was, but I was born in Jackson.
Yeah, man. Born and raised in Jackson, Michigan. We were proud members of Kelsey Hayes Credit Union there in Jackson. High school, I was a jock, man. I played sports year round. That was my identity. Sports were my parent. It was, how I saw myself. I think, I wasn't quiet. I wasn't the most popular kid, but I was always curious about people and loved making people laugh. But sports were what I were all about, from football to basketball, to track and field. It was my joy.
Now that you're done writing your book, had it published, stop living on autopilot again. What are you reading? Do you have a book recommendation, after everyone finishes yours that they should go out and get?
Oh my goodness. There are so many amazing books that I've read over the course of 2020. I'm actually looking at my bookshelf right now to see if there's anything specifically, that stands out. Right now, I happen to be reading President Obama's book.
Just finished it.
Yeah, I'm reading that now, which I think is like 700 plus pages. So I'll be done in about 2 years.
I should say I listened to the audiobook while I would go for walks. So
yeah. But another book that a book that I actually really, really enjoyed was this book in 2020 called Upstream. Upstream by Dan Heath. Him and his brother wrote the book. I want to think it was called Unstuck or Stick or anyhow.
Yeah.
Upstream by Dan Heath. And he talks about how we can get to the solutions of problems if we look a little bit further up in the stream, as opposed to looking at them where they happen. I did a horrible job of just describing it, but it's a fantastic book.
We will link to that too. The random question: what's the greatest album of all time?
A Tribe Called Quest, Low End Theory, 1992. I still run to it. I still listen to it. I can remember riding around in my mom's Mercury or Ford Topaz in Michigan, listening to that album.
We grew up literally. How old are you? We've got to be the same age. I just, even to the car. So
yeah, I'll just say I'm in my early 40s.
Okay, I'm probably actually a little older than you then, because I'm mid 40s. How about that? So,
well, I use words, so how we define early 40s is up to interpretation.
That's so awesome. I'm just like my parents also had a Topaz, but. So the last question, it's one that I don't send guests beforehand. When you hear the word success, who's the first person that pops in your head?
Holy moly. When I hear the word success, I'm going to think for 1 second on this one right here, because it's such a brilliant question and one that gives me a pause to think about. When I say success, I'm going to say my father, Al Neves, because this is a man who didn't finish his high school education, who enrolled in the Army at 17 years old and kind of lied about his age to make that happen, created a blue collar existence for himself, working in a lot of factories. He's a person that, speaking of Michigan, even though he was raised in Massachusetts, but I come from a place where if there's overtime, you're happy. You sign up. I come from a place where you sign up on a list, hoping you get chosen for overtime. Or nowadays, it seems like people don't want to put in that extra work to get their hands dirty. So that's my dad. And I say that because now, unfortunately, today he has dementia and he's in a home and he can't walk and he can't talk. I can't have a conversation with him anymore. But I think about him as a success. And, Al Neves never saw a fight he didn't want to get in. So I kind of like that about him.
I love it. I love that Dad gets the shout out. It's my favorite question, quite honestly, because we all define it differently, and your answer is one of my favorites on that. That's the perfect way to wrap it up. Thank you again, Antonio, for being on the show and helping us kick off season 3. The last question that I have for you: any final thoughts to share or asks of our listeners today?
I just want to say thank you for having me. I want to thank you for being so open and sharing, what led to this and the new direction of the podcast. And I just want to remind myself and remind listeners that you have a say in this. Every single day we can wake up and recommit to say the best thing is ahead of us as opposed to behind us. But that requires us pointing the finger at ourselves and saying, I have a say in this no matter what's going on out there. I choose how to show up.
Thank you again, my friend. Have a great day, an awesome new year. I can't wait to see you at 2021 Refuel at the end of the year. And I know you'll keep bringing us good stuff.
Yeah, we should meet in Jackson, Michigan one day.
Absolutely. Right, head back. Make the families happy.
See you, man.
Before we go, I'd like to thank all of you for being here in 2021 and listening as we kick off season 3 of this wonderful ride called the CUInsight Experience. And once again, a huge thank you to Antonio for taking the time out of his busy schedule. He is such a pro and actually making space for us today. A big thank you to our sponsor, PSCU. Our friends at PSCU have been longtime partners and supporters of ours at CUInsight, so please make sure to click on their link in the show notes and give them some love, see everything they have going on to help the credit union community. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast player, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. While you're at it, sign up for Antonio's podcast as well while you're there. It's a good one. And last but not least, the CUInsight Experience podcast book list has been updated with all the book recommendations from season 1 and season 2, and even the ones that Antonio messaged today. So what a better place to get book recommendations than from the guests on our show. Thank you all again for listening. Have a great day, and please be well, friends.